With the NBA season firmly in its second half and rapidly approaching the playoffs, teams have begun to bear down and lock in as the postseason picture becomes clearer and clearer. And while for older, more seasoned teams that have been in the playoff picture before, this may be as simple as stepping on the gas a bit to finish the season strong. But as a viewer, this has been a pretty revealing time for me in terms of seeing which teams are legit or not. In the East, no team is a bigger example of this concept than the Cleveland Cavaliers, whom I had accidentally made fun of prior to the season before they decided to lock in and legitimately become one of the best teams in the NBA. And over in the West, the Young Thunder have been on fire for the entire year. But one team I've consistently briefly talked about in this category is the Houston Rockets, who managed to jump out and even briefly hold the second seed in a stacked Western Conference for the majority of the season, which led to a lot of discussion about who and what was making this team so effective. And there were a ton of different guys getting credit, ranging from the sneaky good season that Dillon Brooks was having from three to the underrated scoring year that Jalen Green was having. And of course, the Terror Twins were crowned as one of the scariest defensive duos in the league. But within all of this talent, the Rockets also have one of the most confusing and interesting player stories in the league, because they have a proven offensive dynamo who somehow can't seem to find his way onto the court for consistent minutes, that being Cam Whitmore. Whitmore, who's had some solid performances on the stat sheet, was pretty outspoken earlier this year about his frustration with his role and inability to get on the court. And while at a glance, his story seemed like a traditional one of a great player being held back, a closer look reveals that his stellar production is only a band-aid on some of the more glaring holes that he has in his game. And when you look at his journey from high school through college and in his first 2 years in the league, it can tell us a lot about the current state of player development, superstardom, and how accolades and awards can often be just as much of a detriment to a player as they are a benefit. So let's talk about Cam Whitmore, the politics of development, and the age-old adage that everything that glitters isn't gold. With Whitmore only being 2 seasons into his young career, it's important to look at how he arrived in Houston and what he was expected to be coming into the league. And a brief look at his pre-NBA career makes it clear why he's so frustrated. Because from the time he was in high school, he seemed like he was determined to make himself a star. Coming out of high school, Whitmore was considered by many to be one of, if not the best athlete in the class of 2022, and he was a consensus 5-star prospect across every major recruiting platform. He played high school ball for Archbishop Spalding in Maryland, where he averaged 21.4 points and 10.6 rebounds over his senior year, while absolutely cleaning up in the awards department, not only securing Maryland's Gatorade Player of the Year, but also being selected to the Iverson Game, Jordan Brand Classic, and McDonald's All-American Game. But even with these accolades, Whitmore separated himself from the rest of his recruiting class in the summer of 22, where he played in the U18 America's Championship game with Team USA and dominated in the scoring department, but simultaneously raised a few valid concerns for his future. Over the 6 games, he'd play alongside fellow top-tier prospects Jared McCain, Stephon Castle, and Khalil Ware, and positioned himself as a superstar, averaging a team-best 18.7 points and 6.3 rebounds on 63% shooting from the field and 45.5% shooting from 3 as the US swept their way to a 6-0 gold medal finish. And while Whitmore would end up walking away with the MVP of the tournament, more than a few scouts were unimpressed with the 1.7 assists that he averaged, and even less impressed with the 1.7 turnovers that he put up. This concern not only about his playmaking, but his overall feel for the game, while minor, would soon enough come to define his play and really the trajectory of his career going forward. But at the time, with him having looked this dominant on a global stage of his peers, Whitmore was entering his freshman year at Villanova with quite a lot of hype. Unfortunately though, the start to his regular season would be delayed by a thumb injury which kept him out for the first 6 games, and when he finally did get on the court, despite his dominance on paper, he had one of the more controversial seasons in college ball. Over the 26 games he played, Whitmore would average an impressive 12.5 points and 5.3 rebounds to go along with 1.4 steals on 47.8% shooting from the field and 34.3% from 3 on 4.2 attempts a game. His production would not only earn him a unanimous selection to the Big East all-freshman team, but also the Big East Freshman of the Year award, and overall, he put together a freshman season that, at a glance, should have easily launched him into lottery pick contention. But over the draft evaluation process, fans, scouts, and even Whitmore's own coaches raised red flags about Cam and his game that would not only tank his draft stock, but strangely enough, predict how his young NBA career would go on to play out. From the fan perspective, Villanova viewers and scouts noted that Cam had a tendency to become a ball stopper on offense, regularly slowing down the team when looking to make a decision and developing tunnel vision when looking to create his own shot, even though he was able to find some success as a difficult shot maker. Furthermore, the passing concerns that alarmed scouts the previous summer had developed into a legitimate problem, as Whitmore only averaged 0.7 assists while putting up a horrendous 1.7 turnovers, which becomes even worse when you take into account that his 25.8% usage rate placed him at 6th in the Big East. This was a point that was brought up heavily in his draft scout, alongside his lack of true on-ball creation outside of difficult shots and his tendency to swing for home run defensive plays, rather than sitting down to guard for long stretches. And this all led to him being described by his draft scout as, quote, not yet being the sum of his parts. These issues alone were enough to affect his draft status, but the real bombshell dropped when it came out that Whitmore's own coach, Kyle Neptune, who was in his first year as the head coach of Villanova, was allegedly speaking down on Whitmore during the draft process and causing more and more teams to steer away from what was initially meant to be a lottery pick. And all of these factors came together to see Whitmore fall out of the lottery to the 20th pick, where he joined the Houston Rockets as yet another wing option in an increasingly crowded department. To pause for a bit, the way that Whitmore's rise as a prospect and ultimately his draft journey played out all seems like a larger effect of that superstar chasing, somewhat empty production driven basketball that's been incentivized in the way the game has been talked about in the media. From the time that Whitmore burst onto the scene as a prospect, it seems like the very clear and obvious holes in his game were somewhat overshadowed by his accolades and the belief that stat stuffing in a win was the most important concern. And while I'm absolutely not trying to justify Cam Whitmore's ball-stopping, tunnel vision tendencies by pointing to MJ and LeBron's superstar status, it is interesting that this sort of numbers-chasing approach was able to sustain him for so long. Regardless, when he joined the Rockets, he was doing so with a chip on his shoulder that he wasn't unfamiliar with from his days as an unranked high schooler. And heading into his rookie summer league, he set out to do as he'd always done and put the league on notice that he was a star in the making. And once again, at a glance, Whitmore did just that, bursting onto the scene for the Rockets and averaging 19.3 points and 5.2 rebounds to go along with an unreal 2.5 steals a game, looking like an offensive and defensive superstar. This summer league campaign not only saw Cam flash some of that world-class athleticism that we'd all heard about, but also put up some video game performances defensively, the main one being his 26-point 8-steal night against the Golden State Warriors. These stats and this performance, among many others, were enough for many a Houston fan to rightfully claim that they'd secured the steal of the draft and take a mini victory lap that their franchise's next young star had finally arrived. But it's here where we'll again see that many of the concerns that Cam had shown over his time at Nova were still very prevalent in his game, as he only averaged 1.8 assists, and that was already alarming for someone who had the ball in his hands as often as he did. But the 2.3 turnovers that he averaged made this lack of playmaking all the more apparent. And despite his great point averages, the 44.7% shooting from the field and 28.6% shooting from 3 on over 8 attempts a game made it clear that Whitmore still had a long way to go before he was ready to be a contributor in the league. And his idea of what his role was may not fit with what was waiting for him in Houston. Whitmore was entering his rookie year with the Rockets team that was ridiculously deep at the wing position, with free agent signing Dylan Brooks, Amen Thompson, and Jayshawn Tate all sitting above him in the depth chart, leaving virtually no minutes for Cam and leading to him having a non-existent rookie season for the first 30 games. But while Whitmore wasn't getting any time in the NBA, he was down in the G League doing as he'd always done and producing at a high level, but doing so in a role that simply wouldn't exist for him at the next level. Over the 13 games he played with the Rio Grande Valley Vipers, he'd averaged 26 26.2 points and 6.8 rebounds on 47.5% shooting from the field and 39% from three, at one point leading the G League in scoring. But despite all of his scoring, Whitmore found himself with only a 0.5 net rating, placing him at 267th in the league and painting a very clear picture of empty production. And this stat becomes even worse when you realize that Whitmore was 30th in the league in usage percentage amongst players who played at least 10 games, but his 16% assist percentage placed him all the way at 275th. And obviously, the G League is meant for development, and lambasting a 19-year-old for not immediately growing as a playmaker in a developmental league is a waste of time, especially when most guys go down there to score and not to win. But with Whitmore, as we'll come to find out, he would somewhat be blinded by these inflated numbers. Regardless, by late December, an opportunity would finally arise as Houston would call him up, and while he'd have an impressive first game, dropping 12 points in a loss to the Suns, following a DMP, Whitmore would go on a run for Houston. For the remainder of his rookie year, he'd make the most of his consistent opportunity, averaging 13.3 points and 4.2 rebounds on 45% shooting from the field and 36.1% from three on 5 attempts a game, seemingly dispelling the rumors about his shooting and proving himself as a viable scoring option for a Rockets team that was 19th in offensive rating when he joined and desperately needed another scorer. And when you pair these numbers with seemingly impressive defensive production, which saw Cam end his rookie year in an above-average 61st and 64th percentile for block and steal percentage, as a whole, you have the picture of an incredible year. But yet again, the added context of what it took for Whitmore to have this run calls into question if it was truly a good sign or not. Defensively, the advanced stats beyond block and steal percentage make it clear that Cam still wasn't maximizing his physical tools for full possessions, as opponents not only shot 2.4 percentage points better when guarded by him, but they were scoring 1 more point per possession with him on the floor and shooting 0.7 percentage points better as a team, placing him in the 43rd and 36th percentile respectively in these defensive categories. Furthermore, by the end of his rookie season, Whitmore would find himself in the 85th percentile of usage rate amongst all forwards at a 23.2% when he was on the floor, but yet again, he'd be at the literal bottom of the league in assist to usage ratio, with his 0.24 placing him in the 0 percentile. But ultimately, despite these tendencies, Whitmore finished his rookie season strong enough to be crowned as one of the league's better emerging young stars, with his tunnel vision and lack of defensive consistency being a recognized but accepted part of his game with hopes of improvement for the future. Unfortunately though, through the first 40 games of the year, the cycle seems to have continued and in some ways gotten even worse. Thus far, Whitmore has found himself playing less NBA minutes, scoring less points, getting less shots, and shooting a lower percentage from both the field and three. And as Houston has managed to claw their way into the playoff picture, he's found himself on the fringes of the rotation as the third string forward, caught in a cycle of sporadic minutes and a desperation to prove that he deserves to play with big-time scoring performances whenever he does make it onto the court, inadvertently causing him to lean further into his playmaking inadequacies by forcing the scoring issue to prove a point. And all of this came to a head earlier this year where, after scoring 18 points against the Mavs, in an awkward post-game interview, Cam insinuated that he was frustrated and unsure of his role on a team where he'd seemingly proved himself to be a valuable asset time and time again. And this cycle that Whitmore's found himself in can serve as a cautionary tale for the aspiring big-time scorer archetype in the league, as well as a case study in how stat chasing and one-note production isn't the formula to superstardom that fans and the media have made it out to be. The constant statistical obsession with big-name stars and highlight culture has somewhat helped foster players like Whitmore, where the focus on scoring and home run plays offensively and defensively builds players that become incapable of patching the obvious holes in their game that may not show up on the stat sheet. From the time he was in high school, Whitmore's tendency to search for big-time buckets, blocks, or steals rather than playing solid defense or making the right pass that didn't show up in the box score was brought up in every report written about him. and even contributed to his fall in the draft alongside some unfortunate injuries. But rather than focusing on these shortcomings in a way that would help him get on the court for longer stretches, these highlights and big box scores are what would help him gain attention for his cause, thus forcing him to lean into these inadequacies more and more. It's like a weird basketball version of the age-old idiom that everything that glitters isn't gold, where that constant pursuit of something that has all the glimmer of superstardom and talent is ultimately worthless in the bigger picture. And understand, Whitmore does have valid reason to feel frustrated with his role, and he's an undeniable talent as a player. But it's that constant chase for superstardom that's ruined many a talented player in the league in the past, and earned more than a few big-time scorers the label of being one-note shot chuckers that won't ever be anything greater. But even with all of the shortcomings that have been highlighted about Cam, he undoubtedly has all of the talent and tools to be everything that scouts and he himself knows that he can be. And with him only being 20 years old and in his second season, this video can surely be interpreted as premature, because the sky is still the limit for what he can go on to be. So regardless of how it came across, I'm certainly still rooting for Cam. But with all that being said, that's gonna do it for this one. Hopefully you enjoyed, and hopefully I can catch you in the next one.